All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking a trip over to Perth. I'm so glad. I thought no one would actually turn up. But yeah, thank you so much. It's really great to have OZeWAI here in Perth. So this presentation, thank you, Andrew, for allowing me your time slot for this one, because it follows on quite well from the panel we had before, and also to Giselle's presentation. So I'm going to be talking about accessibility complaints today, and this came about because I got talking to Bruce Maguire, who was mentioned earlier, and he was the man who bravely took on the Sydney Olympic Games in 2000 in a lawsuit. And I got speaking to him about the complaints process here in Australia and some of his experiences on what it's like to actually raise accessibility complaints and some of the problems that he ran into when trying to do so. So this may not be a reflection of everyone's experience, but it's a reflection of what might happen if you're someone with a disability and you're trying to raise an accessibility complaint. So my outline today, I'm going to talk about why complaints are good, Australian law, complaints process in Australia, 3 failures of why organisations get complaints wrong, effective handling of complaints, and what people with disabilities can do. Very quickly, Vision Australia, we're very similar to Visibility in that we provide services for the blind and low vision community. My team's digital access team, we're pan-disability, so we cover all sorts of disabilities out there. And in fact, we have recently just turned 20 years old. Yay! So yeah, that's really cool. Disclaimer, I am obviously not a lawyer, and information in this presentation should not be used as a source of legal advice. So, as Julie mentioned in her presentation yesterday, complaints are clues. They are good. They are effectively an opportunity, and in some ways you can think of them as free user testing. Pretty much people are offering, hey, I have a problem with your website, and people shouldn't say and scorn them and go, oh, well, I've got a problem, got to fix now, bloody hell. They should really take that as an opportunity to improve their website. So addressing a complaint can also leave a really good impression, not only on the person who complained, but also for other people with disabilities who also encountered that issue but didn't bother to complain, because if they complain for every single little issue, then they'll probably be complaining for forever. So it helps all those other people who also encountered that issue. And also, people with disabilities can learn which organisations have the right attitude based on how they address complaints. So, it actually creates good PR for that organisation, and it spreads throughout the disability communities. When an organisation is receptive to complaints and actually goes about resolving them, that leads to things like ending up in the accessibility awards, and it ends up being really good PR for the organisation. Not going to go too into the lawsuit since we've already talked a fair bit about them, but of course, Bruce Maguire, Sydney Olympic Games in 2000, he sued their website because he wanted to get some early bird tickets, and the website was inaccessible, and also other printed resources were inaccessible. So he sued the Sydney Olympic Games, and that one was settled out of court. Coles, of course, Giselle, sued Coles in 2014 because the online ordering website is inaccessible, and that was also settled out of court. And then Commonwealth Bank, more recently in 2019, their Albert terminals were inaccessible for the blind, and that was also settled out of court. So there's a bit of running theme there. All of those were settled out of court. And this is where we follow on from Giselle's presentation, where we got this soft peanut butter law. Often a lot of people quote this from the DDA: it is unlawful for a person who, whether for payment or not, provides goods or services or makes facilities available to discriminate against another person on the ground of the other person's disability. And then it goes on to a few subpoints. But this is soft peanut butter law. It's not a hard law, and I was talking to my girlfriend about this just yesterday, about this law, and she's a law student, and she was telling me that the reason why likely this remains as a soft law is because when you do decide to make something a hard law, it becomes very, very difficult to change. So it means that when new accessibility guidelines and things come out, we're still going to be stuck with the old guideline, and it can be difficult to change what's already put in place in that hard law. Now, that's sort of more of a criticism of the Australian legal system and how quickly it moves, but it goes to show why the Australian government have left that as a soft, smooth peanut butter law rather than going to the crunchy. So for people with disabilities, they have the right to forward their complaints to the Australian Human Rights Commission. But what actually does that mean? So I got a little flow chart up on the screen now, which I'll read out. So someone has an accessibility complaint, and then that complaint just gets ignored by the organisation for whatever reason that we'll get to later. And then the person who complained can then plead their case to the Australian Human Rights Commission. The Australian Human Rights Commission then repeats that complaint in a slightly more formal way, and then the organisation replies or simply ignores the complaint again, and then it's up to the complainant to decide if that response was satisfactory or not. What can happen in a lot of these cases is that, as Bruce was telling me, that after Australian Human Rights Commission gets involved and sends their complaint through, the organisation immediately starts to lawyer up, and that's when it becomes very, very scary. So at the end of the day, Australian Human Rights Commission is just a mediator between the complainant and the organisation. It's ultimately still up to the person with a disability to make enforceable action with a lawsuit if things go sour. But lawsuits are, of course, very risky. To do it alone, it's almost impossible. You do need a lot of funding, and it's years of very complex legal work. You need to dedicate quite a lot of your time to this lawsuit, and unless you've got support from another organisation or many other people with disabilities, you are going to struggle in actually being successful in that lawsuit, and actually it comes up to the fact that is it even worth it to even try and go through a lawsuit. So organisations, because complaints are good to actually take seriously, what are some pitfalls that organisations often come up with? So the first sort of failure comes where someone makes a complaint to the organisation, and the contact at the organisation has no idea what this accessibility thing is. And they go, what web accessibility? What's a screen reader? I don't know what this is. And so they send back a generic message saying, okay, we'll look into it, and then they never hear about it again. And that is a failure because the social media team or the communication team at the organisation doesn't know where to send the accessibility complaint. They don't even know what it is, let alone where to send it. So that is a failure for the organisation for not preparing their contact team on how to actually handle these sorts of complaints. The second sort of failure is a complaint gets sent through to the organisation, and this time the organisation actually does acknowledge the complaint, and detail is received on what the issue is, and it gets sent to the correct department, and it even gets logged in a bug tracking tool. Excellent. And then the issue takes a long time to implement. Quite often, when you're talking to developers, they say, oh yeah, this might roll out in the next few months. But during that time, the initial complainer is going, okay, what's going on? Is the issue going to be resolved or not? And so they never hear back, so they go to the Australian Human Rights Commission and say, hey, nothing's happening. What's going on? So that is a failure of communication between the complainant and the organisation. So you need to actually go back to the complainant and say, yes, we've actually given ETA on when it's going to be resolved, and also actually tell them when it is resolved. And then the third sort of failure is one that Bruce told me he often goes through, where he submits an accessibility complaint, the complaint gets acknowledged, and then he gets asked for more details. The complainant then provides details to the organisation, maybe by actually going and visiting their offices and actually talking to them in person. It seems like really getting their attention now. And the organisation says, yep, we've got everything we need now, and the issue is going to be resolved. And then it seems like nothing happens. You wait a while, it's going, okay, what's going on? So the complainant contacts, hey, what's going on with this issue? Is it still going to be fixed? And the organisation just goes, can you come in and give us some more detail? And it ends up being this cycle, this string-along loop of continually asking for more and more and more detail, and nothing ever actually happens, which is, it may be seen as malicious. Some organisations might be doing it maliciously. I hope not. But it may just be a breakdown in the organisation itself where the detail isn't actually getting to the right people, or it's just not being taken seriously enough to get resolved. So how should an organisation handle a complaint and avoid a pitfall? So I got this flowchart, which is a little bit complex, but I'll go through it. It's fairly straightforward. Basically, an accessibility complaint comes in. The organisation should acknowledge that complaint, gets the detail they need, and send it to the correct department. It then, importantly, gets placed into that bug tracking software. And then there should be a process in place to update the initial complainant. So every time a milestone is reached, so the developer looks at the issue and says, oh yes, I can resolve this issue immediately, or in the next few weeks, that information gets fed back to the initial complainant so that they know what is happening and what's going on. So there needs to be collaboration between the development teams and also the actual social media contact person so that they can update the complainant. And then eventually a solution is reached on the issue. And then, if possible, if you have it available, test with people with disability first, ideally in your own organisation, to see if the issue is actually resolved before you go back to the complainant. Because it can be really frustrating to say, yep, the issue is resolved now, you can now use it, and then the complainant goes on, it's like, no, it's actually still not working too well. And if there are issues with testing with your people with disabilities, then further changes are needed. So it goes back to the bug tracking and it goes through as many times as it needs to until that issue is resolved, what it seems like internally. And then finally, you go back to the initial complainant and say, yep, we've tested with our own people with disabilities. We're pretty sure the issue is resolved. We'd like for you to actually confirm that. Can you actually access the content now? So that is how you should properly handle a complaint in a best case scenario. You might need to change this up based on your organizational structure and what resources you have available to you. You may not have any access to people with disabilities. You may not have the budget for it. But at the very least, keep the initial complainant informed, get it into that bug tracking software, and make sure they actually hear about it when it's fixed. If you want to actually have the best chance for your complaints to count before you go to the Australian Human Rights Commission to lodge a formal complaint, you can use the W3C's template for making a complaint. So W3C has gone through and given several different templates of an issue on a website, and you can use this template to make your complaint sound a little bit more robust and professional. And it also it pretty much works like fill in the blanks. So you fill in what parts you need to. I tried to do this. The problem was that. That's meant I was unable to do that. And it makes it very, very clear for the organisation what the actual problem is. So I recommend going there. The URL is up on the slide, or you can just Google contacting organisations about inaccessible websites, and you'll find a link in Google. Thank you so much for your time. Any questions?
Alrighty. Well, Matt's put it out there. Has anyone got any particular questions for Matt? Oh, sorry, Mark.
I suppose it's more a point than a question, I suppose, but we talk about the legal case. You want to sue them.
Yep.
I think, personally, most of these organisations in Australia and probably the world know the fact that it's a very expensive case to sue them. You'll get away with it.
Mm.
Their poor service is, they know they're going to get away with it.
Absolutely.
How do we get around that? Is there any way? Do we try and get class actions or whatever?
Class actions may be one way, absolutely. If you can get enough people with disabilities to actually say, yes, this is an issue, then that will have a lot more weight to it. But for the most part, there isn't a whole lot you can do legally besides hoping that the cultures of organisations improve by, us as a community helping these organisations to actually understand accessibility, and that it's not just a legal threat, not just some red tape that's pointless, and we're not just out to get organisations money. We are there to actually try and improve their service for everyone. And so, yeah, people have rights, and it's important that they're upheld.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that most businesses who are in the business of making money are aware of is that word of mouth is the most useful and positive and helpful for making money that almost anything else is. So even if a legal case isn't brought, if enough people with disabilities will write or email or phone and say this doesn't work, and say it loudly enough and make sure that all their organisations and every group that they belong to know that this isn't enough. This may have, not saying will, but may have some effect, because I think most businesses rely hugely on word of mouth, and if the word of mouth is negative, then maybe it will have some sort of effect. Maybe.
I think it was Alicia Patterson who said this, but I remember her saying, it always stuck out in my mind, where she said, if I complained about every accessibility issue, I'll be complaining to the end of time. And she really needs to pick her battles on what to complain about. So yeah, absolutely, people need to speak up more, but also they shouldn't have to.
Should we ask our web team to provide a place where you can register something so that the complainant could actually write down? Like a ticket. Yeah, like a ticket, but pursue the path that they've chosen, but also just register somewhere on our website, and if you saw a lot of complaints against some particular group, maybe they'd see them too.
Maybe we can highlight good groups.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
Excellent. I think there'll be more conversations at afternoon tea with you, Matthew. So would you all join with me and thank you, Matthew, for this afternoon?
Thank you very much.